Am I live? Can you guys hear me? Let's see. This is my, yo, you can. This is my, okay, great. Well, this is a go. It happened. Usually I'm like Mr. Magoo with these kind of things, but I kind of make my way through it. Hello, everybody. Okay. All right. So I wanted to just go over a couple things from the video, and what you can do is you guys can, everyone, I gotta get away from using you guys. If you have a question specifically about the video or any video of mine or the work that I do in general, you can go right to my Instagram and give me a DM, and I will be monitoring my messages through that. Someone already sent me one, and I can answer that one as well. But I want to just reiterate a couple things of the video that you just watched. ADHD versus, or is it trauma noise? Were most of you all there for that? Did you guys watch that with me? Names look familiar. Cool. I'm just gonna say hello. This is fun. Although it's like, it's for someone who has ADHD, I mean, mine, I think through my trauma work got resolved. It's kind of it must be kind of a little bit of a nightmare to do the chat, do the thing, do this, like you're driving a tractor or something, wearing a bunch of different hats. Okay, do I have any questions? I got one question so far. So you go right to my Instagram, you send me a DM there. Try to make it kind of short, or try to do your best on the shorter side if you have a question about the video or any of my videos, or about the work. And there is a couple things that I just want to talk about from that video, just to reiterate a couple things. We'll start with some kind of housekeeping stuff from the video, where, as I mentioned in that spiel that I do have a new tier on my Patreon. I'm doing a monthly, it's like a monthly kind of chat group thing through Zoom, and for $20 every month, you get to join. It's intimate, and if you don't want to be on the screen, you can turn your camera off. But it's really a discussion with me that goes much more. I can see you and you can see me. I'm really excited about that. The first one is on May 18th, and you can just sign up for that to the Patreon. So there's that thing. We are still, I'm training a bunch of therapists, and I'm working with a collective of therapists who are doing this work through my mentor, Amanda Curtin. And we're offering therapy services to those who are stuck in Ukraine or getting out, or variations of that. If you know anybody, please spread the word about that. They're kind of trickling in. And we feel good about doing that. There is a barrier. We are only English speaking, so the person would have a kind of a good enough sense of the English language. This weekend, I'm doing a training for therapists and holistic practitioners and life coaches. It's called RRP, which really just means relationship recovery program, which is the type of therapy that we do. And in that training, I'm getting into how to start working with the inner child through something called dialoguing. And again, it's for therapists. It is for holistic practitioners and life coaches. So if you're interested in that, just go to my website. It's the first thing there. And there's a feature on this live stream that I am new to, and I'm new to a lot of. I've been on YouTube for a while, but I'm new to a lot of the features. If on the bottom there is a way that you can support the channel. I believe it's called a super thanks. And you just sort of contribute financially to the channel. They give you a little bit of gift, kind of make you feel good. The gifts are kind of fun, but that would be greatly appreciated for supporting the channel and the work that goes into it. And you could do that if you're not really linked up with the Patreon, because some people don't really get Patreon and they don't really know how it works. Simple, you just type in your credit card information. I'm sure there's other things going on there. I haven't seen it myself, but I do see the little button down there if you want to do that. Okay, moving right along. And yeah, so a couple things about that video. Just want to, because it all happened so quickly and I tend to talk fast, is some things I want to reiterate in that video. I'm not in any way discounting ADHD. That can really simply manifest a little bit genetically in kids, perfectly fine. If it's not coming with a childhood trauma story, my message is not, if you have ADHD, you have childhood trauma. My message is they look exactly the same, and we need to explore or really check out if people do have a childhood trauma history, because the symptoms are like so close together and there's so many overlapping. And related to that, I also do plan on doing a video on how to, I'm going a little bit too fast. If you're in treatment for ADHD, perfectly fine. You know, it's going to be helpful, whether that's medication or working with someone about organization or how your brain works, perfectly cool. It's just not going to touch childhood trauma symptoms, I think, if you're not processing those things through something like the work that I do or EMDR. So just want to kind of clarify that. And the ADHD trauma question really comes down to, it sounds goofy, about whether the person has a history or not. And probably raise your hand if you've had your own process of figuring out if you've had to almost learn if you had a trauma history or not. Like when I was 20 and I got to therapy, I could tell you things were weird in my family, but I would have said I have PTSD or childhood trauma, or I suffer from narcissism abuse, or any of that kind of stuff. So we all go through, I think, a process of kind of awakening or educating ourselves to that. So there is that. Let's take a little poll and raise your hand. Would you guys want to jump into some questions, or do you have questions about the video? What do you guys want to do? Let me be clear about the options. I could keep talking about the video and reiterate things, or do you just want to jump to the questions? Who wants me to talk and reiterate more stuff about the video? Raise your hand. You missed the video. It's perfectly fine. It's still there. So I'm feeling questions. I'm kind of I wrote the video, I recorded the video, I just watched the video. I'm a little bit sick of the video. All right, jump into some questions. So if you have a short question, you can put it in the chat, but why don't we just go, and we'll do this for about maybe a good, I don't know, 20 minutes, a half hour. And we'll dive into some questions. The better place to write the question where I can get it is through my Instagram. And if I see some already. Whoa. All right, you got them going on, and my Instagram handle is right there. So let's do that, and I'm going to be reading these. So excuse me if I'm ignoring the chat. Hello, everybody. Thank you for stopping by. Check out the super thanks button. Greatly helps the channel. And let's dive in. I'm going to do them in order that I get them. And let me just give me a second to read it. If I can't answer it and it's too complex or maybe too triggering, I might try to answer it privately tomorrow. So that's a good way to do it. So, and I'm not going to name who wrote the question, but Patrick, thank you for all your videos. I do have a question. When functioning is complicated by physical illness, how do you recover? For instance, I have emotional hangups with cleaning and a learned helplessness there. But right now in my life, I'm not well enough to spend much time on cleaning. So sometimes I feel like I don't know how to even access that aspect of recovery. Not sure if that makes sense. I think I get it, but your insight and videos are incredibly helpful. So when we have either an illness that takes over, first of all, we can raise your hand again, is I really believe that when we get sick, it is a deep, deep primal trigger. Even if you get a cold, I find that most trauma survivors we wrestle with being sick way too much, because I think we associate sickness with like depression, or that we're not on top of things. Trauma survivors, we love to be on top of things. So I just think if we're not feeling well or we have something going on, it wrecks us. And I really think it comes back to the way that we were parented around being sick. And that it could be from either neglect. I tend to think about things on a spectrum, the neglect of it, where sometimes we don't even know we're sick. So it's just a complicated, messy kind of thing. But to answer your question, what I would do is kind of prioritized as best. This is from the adult and the inner child lens. From the adult lens, or to find your adult in it, is you may have to get to a place where you really pick your battles and kind of give up on things like cleaning the house if you're not feeling well, or that kind of a thing. And it's going to drive you crazy. From the inner child lens, I would recommend journaling and really trying to zero in on how your inner child is feeling about being sick and not being able to function the way that you want to. So there is prioritizing about, like if someone, I don't know, someone's recovering from like a chemo and the cancer's gone, but like chemotherapy wipes people out. And that's a place where we're going to be triggered about we don't have the energy. We've really been zapped, and all our energy is zapped. We're not in a good emotional place. And to force ourselves or to feel bad about not cleaning isn't good for us. So for the adult to kind of come back to the child level and kind of say, I think we just have to really give ourselves a green light for now until we feel better. But what comes up for you about not being able to clean? How is it like childhood in any way? I find that we can go through kind of just feeling better or energetic shifts if our inner child feels heard and is able to talk about the past and how it's influencing the present. So that, hopefully that makes sense, but that would be my answer there. Did that make sense to you guys, if you're with me on that? Anyone relate to the question about being sick and just really struggling with like what, not being able to do what you want to do? So thank you very much for that question. Let me just, moving on. Let me see. How many percent of people do you think are misdiagnosed with ADHD while they actually have childhood trauma? I don't have the numbers, but in my world, how I think, I'm also biased because I'm so in the childhood trauma world. I think it's a lot. And it's so much a lot in my mind that only in the past couple years have I been more open to ADHD just happening organically on its own. So I'm still in a process about it. But to answer that question, I think it's massive. I also think that across the board, unless it's something like psychosis, unless it's something like a bipolar disorder, unless it's something like a severe debilitating mental illness, I think childhood trauma is misdiagnosed across the board. And I've seen that when I worked at the Department of Veteran Affairs and patient psychiatry. I've seen it everywhere. For example, or even not even consider the childhood trauma piece in CPTSD. I would be working with vets, and other clinicians around me would only be focused on what happened to somebody on deployment, but they would never talk about their alcoholic father. They would never really get an in-depth history, because it's not just the present trauma. It's like CPTSD it's levels of it. So hopefully that makes sense to answer that question. How am I doing? Am I doing okay for you guys? Can you hear me? Am I on task? Cool. Got it. The math, someone's asking about I'm working with trainees and we're forming groups in North Carolina and Massachusetts. And both of those, the groups that are forming in both of those states, they're not located at any specific location, because the question is, what city is your Massachusetts supports groups in? They're all done on Zoom. You just have to be a resident of both of those states, unfortunately, because of licensing requirements for the trainees. There's that one. Blasting through these. Okay, let me just read this for a second. Okay, as I work through my trauma to try to understand myself, I go through, you guys are going to relate to this. It's an excellent question. I go through a cycle of feeling better and then going back to all my negative self-thoughts and actions. And as time drags on, I get more depressed. I'm not getting anywhere. Do you have a video on how to deal with this? I feel lost and what to do next. Great question. Who relates to it? Raise your hand. Who has a couple good days with this stuff? You might get really jazzed about a video or a concept, and the conditioning comes back and you kind of feel like you're right back to square one. Very, very common. I don't know what you're doing for recovery, but and I hate that I give this recommendation because I know how hard it is to find one, is to really search, to really try to find a really good trauma therapist. I'm going to plan on doing a video around that, and really, because in some parts of it is, if we're not seeing a person, if we're not going to a support group, if we're not even going to a 12-step thing like Al-Anon or CODA, if we're just doing it on its own, full disclosure, and a lot of you guys might really not like this, is I don't fully believe in self-healing, because my process was, I had kind of a luxurious process, because I know that this is hard to find. Self-healing is great. It's good for like really educating yourself and that kind of a thing. But I really think going to groups as best as you can, going to a therapist as best as you can, really have a group of friends who are going through the same thing, is we need support. We can't really do it alone. And I'm just assuming, you didn't really say that in your message. But so there's that. Recovery is going to be climbing like a mountain. If you picture a stock graph, and you're going to go up, then you're going to go down. You're going to go up, you're going to go down. But on the over arc of the thing is better and better. And I do know what you mean. Is I just think that if you keep having one good day and then treading water for a couple of weeks, I think you might need to try some different things, whether that's therapy. I'm not such a big advocate on medications. I like them as a catalyst around childhood trauma or trauma. But the other side of me is I understand that some people sort of function better with them. I'm pro medication. I'm just not pro medication being the only treatment for anything. I think that's kind of gross to me. So I hope that answers the question. It is common, but I think if you just find yourself in this repetitive cycle, you may have to try something different than what you're kind of doing. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. The questions, they go right to my Instagram. If you got them, if you're just joining now, and I could read them from there, so much easier than reading them on the chat because I might lose them in the chat. Okay. Wow, I got a bunch more questions. Great. Let me go back to where I was. Okay. How do you, I think I understand this question. How do you separate the bad person from the good morals they pretend to have when you are those morals, good morals? I think I get the question. It just really comes down to me that I think with the more trauma work that we do, how do I put this one? I really think that childhood trauma, the abuse of it is around abuse of connection and abuse of perception. And by that, raise your hand out there if you've ever struggled or you still struggle with being a good judge of character. Who struggles out there if someone has a really good airtight argument that you feel that you kind of become submissive to them and you lose your truth? So this is what the question, I think I get the question in that way. So common, you know what I mean? Like, it's just sort of like when I started my treatment, when I was 20, I'm like, this is the greatest band I've ever heard in my life. I love this band. This is amazing. And if someone was like, yeah, but this band, like that would somehow go through me. Like I didn't have the right to preferences, and then I would self-doubt and all kinds of stuff. So I think what the question is about, how do you separate a bad person from good morals? It almost makes me think about religious superiority. This is not an attack on someone who is religious. Religion is fine. It gets us through the dark nights. Perfectly fine. But when someone is fundamentally religious or uses religion as a weapon, I think we need to do some inner child work to really have the adults stick to their guns, or to kind of say, well, wait a minute, what do we think? Like they're really good at sprouting off all these moralistic things, but are they like not a good charactered person? Like that is sort of really, really tough. And as trauma survivors, you have the right to make that decision. You're just probably going to need some help with it. So I hope that I've understood the question there. Okay. Can you talk about using art to work through past trauma? I've been drawing previous traumatic events as a kind of comic, and it's been kind of cathartic, and it helps talk about things in session. I got to do this. So this is a little bit of, I'm a huge comic book fan, and sorry that I'm just kind of like not even reading the question, but this is called The Greatest Kid on Earth, Jimmy Corrigan, The Greatest Kid on Earth. This is a beautiful walkthrough of generational trauma. And going through in a comic book form about what happens to this kid and what happened to his grandparent. It is amazing. Art, whether art or music, is definitely a way to express the trauma. But let me read the question before I went off on that little tangent. Can you talk about using art to work through past trauma? I've been drawing previous traumatic events as a kind of comic, and it's been cathartic. Helps me talk about things in session. I feel alone in exploring trauma this way. I keep feeling like I'm doing therapy wrong with this approach. My current therapist has been very supportive with me, continuing to make those drawings. I think to keep it going, but where I just, want to I would ask is how versed is the therapist in childhood trauma? And do they have a plan to get you through? Because it's coming up with your idea, but the where I when I got to the therapist that I worked with, now my mentor, she had an agenda and concrete things that we were doing. The art is a beautiful expression of processing some trauma, but I don't think it's kind of enough. I don't. You may sort of want to think about, say, is there something else you can add to it? And in a way, I also this is also going to maybe seem a little bit like a little bit wacky, is I really believe that healing trauma, this is back to the self-healing thing. I think it's better to do it in a community of people because they act like witnesses in mirroring of which we don't get in our family system. So I hope that I've answered that question. But as a comic book fan, as a musician myself, is like, what got me through my childhood was playing drums in adolescence and teenage years. But it was the expression of rage that I could turn into an art. But later, I still needed to talk about those things and do a deep dive and process and therapy in that way. I don't think it's, I just trying to say, I think it's beautiful, but I don't think it's enough. Let's see. As I work with my trauma and try to understand myself, I go through a cycle of feeling better and then going back. Oh, wait a minute. Um, did I already read this one? Yes, I've already read that one. Sorry about that. Let me go back to the things, my list here. Okay. And again, if you want to ask me a question, you go right to my Instagram. There I am right there. You send me a DM and I'll get it. How do we heal or manage judgment from those in our lives, wanted or unwanted, who judge and ridicule us during moments of dissociation about hygiene and cleaning as if it's supposed to be helpful? We already feel shame about it and don't need any more of it from them. I think that question would um, I would just kind of recommend getting safe from those people, getting some safety, getting some space if that's possible. Because there's where if you grew up in a toxic family, this is the top tier trait of a toxic family is when you are down and at your worst, they will kick you on the ground. Raise your hand if you relate to that in some way. That when like whether all different variations of different families, affluent families, poor families, crazy families, like families that look good on paper, it doesn't matter. I find in our adulthood, whether that's you're struggling with like getting it together or hygiene or stuff like that, or this is a common one for my clients that they just realized they just heard that their partner is going to divorce them after 10 years of it not working out. They call their mom, and the abusive mom says, "Well, I never liked them. I could have told you that 10 years ago." Like that's an example of where our families will just punch us in the gut. If it's family or if it's somebody else, like a partner or roommate or friend, um, I would really withdraw from them if they are just are they if they're just you know really like they in some ways people will look for the opportunity to kick you when you down too. I don't want to sound like I'm conspiracy theory, but this is really what I see. And coming back to a prior question about morals and judgments or that kind of a thing, you've probably heard me say at some point is um, we no longer let toxic people tell us who we are anymore. And that's like I put that on Instagram, and it was like my biggest kind of a thing. And I think it came from something I said in one of my videos that makes me think about that. So again, if you have any questions, write over to my Instagram. I got another one here. Hi, Patrick. A few things. Your video is flipped left to right, making the text of your laptop backwards. Thank you. Because I put this thing backwards, not knowing. Let me fix this. Let me go back to this. Liberty do. Just bear with me 1 second. All right. How's that? Because that was backwards for me. Did that fix it? Oh, that must have been driving you guys crazy. Did it work? Thank you very much for letting me know. All right. What's trauma noise in more detail? I very clearly have PTSD symptoms, but it seems like I also clearly have and always had ADHD symptoms. Yes, it's messy to figure those out. That seems distinct and hard to distinguish between them or identify comorbidity considering the overlap. What are important to distinguish between childhood and adult trauma as they relate to experience and treatment? Let me go with that second question, and thank you for fixing that. Um, Trauma noise, I think, really comes up around. Let's just say you and your partner have a bump and you have a fight, or if you don't have, some kind of romantic thing comes up, and that initial, there's a charge to it, like couple A and couple B, or partner A and partner B, they're driving along to Target, and one of them says, well, okay, cool, we got to make this quick because we got to go to that thing. And the other person is like, you never told me that. And they're now in a bump. And trauma noise, then probably, if they're, let's just assume they're both trauma survivors, then the noise starts. And you could almost think about noise not almost in an auditory way, but all of the like frenetic energy that now comes up. One person could be like, what the fuck, you didn't look at the shared calendar, like, oh, I can't believe you did it. And the other person's like, you never told me. Or you know what I mean, or their noise could be like, oh, I always get it wrong, I never look at the calendar, and there's just mess. And you can visibly see how the trauma noise just kind of takes over. If I'm working with a client and I ask them a hard question, and I can just kind of see it because the question might trigger them, it's not my intention, and I can just see them kind of go ding, and they've left the room a little bit. They're now, I know that they are now kind of in the noise, and the gears are kind of going. What it looks like is we might lose our words. We might go into, if we're wired to be a fighter, we might go into lawyer mode. If we're wired to shut down, yes, and like it just spirals, becomes a shit show, to be honest, in the car. And that's the trauma noise kind of coming up. And the noise itself could be about growing up where parents would have big reactions around you disappointing them, big things around communication, big things. Chances are, if you ever don't know about why you're triggered around something, it's probably rooted in shame in some way. So I hope that kind of answers it more in detail, or it could be like, trauma noise. It could be simply, it's there at baseline, and, like who like leaves the house almost in a way that like you can't get it together enough about where's my car, where's my keys, where's my glasses, did I leave the oven on, and you go back and check, but then you're so checked out you forget if you just checked. Anyone do that kind of a thing, or has ever done that? That's an example of trauma noise happening at baseline, where because of the childhood trauma, we're not grounded in our reality in a present way, taking in, that also tells me the story of someone being a bit dissociative, and they're so in that fight in their head about the car. Like coming back to the car thing, when you get to Target, you might be so triggered with your partner or in it, you forget the cheesy poofs. Like that was the reason you went to Target, So I think that's hopefully that answers the question. And what important distinctions between, they always have the cheesy poofs at Target, so they're just going to popped in there. What are the important distinctions between childhood and adult trauma as they relate to experience and treatment? Great question. In the work that I do, where and I kind of irritate clients in this way, I'm really focused on childhood. I'm really focused on their life from 0 to 20. And yes, they can definitely tell me about the assault that happened at the age of 27. I do want to know about that first marriage and divorce that ended by 33. And then sort of like roommate stuff that happened. And, there's also, I tend to call it re-traumatization of stuff that happens in the family. Like people usually come in after they get married because their mom or their dad was so off around that marriage, and it opened them up to how really characterologically challenged that parent is or something like that. So, but there really doesn't have to be important distinctions between the two of them. They all relate. But in my work, where the inner child, when we're triggered, the inner child looks at the present through the lens of childhood. So that's why I really try to focus with the person on how, when they're triggered in the present at Starbucks or whatever, that they can relate that back to childhood. So I don't think I'm doing that question justice, but in my mind, it doesn't really matter so much. Someone's gonna come in and I'm only gonna like, nope, I don't want to hear anything about. I just want to focus on that car accident when you were 27. It's all connected. So moving on to some questions, but also how am I doing in this thing? Because I'm just reading the questions. We got the chat going on. I do want to put a plug at the super thanks. If you want to contribute to the channel or contribute to the effort that goes into the videos, there's a little button down here. If you don't contribute to my Patreon or don't get it, you can just hit the button down here, and I believe it's a way to just donate to the channel. Okay, or not, or just enjoy the thing. And yeah, what else? All right, I think I got some new questions here. Okay. Hello, I live in Argentina in my city. I went to a couple therapists. When I was a child, around 4 or 5, I went through a series of tests and the doctor said that I had ADHD. My mom didn't want medication. Psychology was a big nope in general. I've struggled my entire life, 24 now. I've managed to go through school and currently I'm suffering through university with all typical symptoms of ADHD, but now no psychiatrist will believe I have ADHD because is widely believed that it's not a thing in adulthood. Wow, that they keep giving me antidepressants. And the articles I show to them in actual treatment, that's a tough one. Where I find that it's just, and another thing about human progress is slow, but every country that I find just has different vibes about mental health treatment at all. Like I've had clients from India and they're like, people don't go to therapy unless you have schizophrenia. And that's the only thing. There's such stigma. You're not going to find a therapist there. I may be generalizing, I may be misinformed, but I've heard that from several clients who immigrated from India to here. And it's such a taboo thing. But I've also just heard, in my mind, it just sounds like wacky stuff. Like, no, ADHD is only for children. I definitely wouldn't agree with that. And it's just sort of like, I really wish I had a better answer for you, but just to honor that your gut is, you're right. That is really, really off. And the only other kind of consideration, if they keep giving you, depressants, are they maybe reluctant to give you stimulants for some other reason going on for the treatment of ADHD? So I'm sorry, I can't really speak more to that, but hopefully you feel a little bit validated about that's really off. Okay. Okay, thank you for that. What's the difference between trauma noise and rejection sensitivity dysphoria? I don't really know too much about it, but it's really probably not that different if the rejection comes from childhood trauma. It's in some ways we don't have to be so semantically accurate. Trauma noise is just something that I made up, is what I saw. It's just an analogy. And that's what psychologists kind of do. Like, like we just kind of see things and we kind of name it, it becomes something else. It's just something that I find I think it's helpful. I like to describe stuff as more kind of tangible ways that are analogies rather than saying, oh, that's just activated in core beliefs. And you know what I mean? And just leave it at that because it's a little bit dry. So I don't really see much of a big difference if rejection sensitive, just, that's where you get massively dysregulated around perceived rejection, real or imagined. Same thing, just trauma noise. If the person has a childhood trauma history, that's what I would think is kind of going on. Hopefully that makes sense. And hopefully I've done the question justice. Okay. Okay, I got a quote here from Martin Luther King. Let's start there. We must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There is some good in the worst of us, some evil in the best of us. When we discover we are less prone to hate our enemies. This triggered me. This is the question. And I don't ascribe to compulsorily forgiveness. Neither do I. Then you ask, am I an asshole? Nope. I've been with a partner for 30 years and I can feel love and I'm capable of that. Forgiveness in my mind is like, I just philosophically is like, well, what does even forgiveness really mean? I mean, we can kind of understand what it means, like on paper, that I forgive you. But I think with trauma work, that forgiveness is the last thing, dead last, if you're interested in it. I think the idea of forgiveness is an overly moralistic kind of a thing, and we can really invalidate people. So common thing is when you start to do your trauma work, you go to your best friend and you're like, I think my mom did this, and you're like, she was like awful. I'm just learning about it, that kind of a thing. And when someone immediately blasts out like, well, she's probably a trauma survivor herself, I think you should forgive her, it totally invalidates, and it totally now keeps the person more in a stuck place. So the opposite of my work is we're really holding parents accountable for how they parented, regardless of their trauma, regardless of what they went through. Because if the victim of trauma doesn't get their day in court in some way, and we impose moralistic ideas around. I don't think Martin Luther King was wrong in it, but you can't blanket statement that for everything. So it's kind of a codependent kind of a thing. And when I mean it's the last thing to go is, my mother was abusive, but I don't toss and turn at night about what my mother did to me because I've spent years in therapy, finishing business and processing and doing all that. And this might be the best way to answer this question. I have empathy for my mother and her alcoholism and her sickness at this point in my recovery, but I don't have sympathy for my mother, and I don't feel bad about that. And that may seem hardcore to you, to some, but it's an amazing question. And I would just say that for trauma recovery, we have to spend a time in our lives in therapy that is only for us and only talking about what happened to us. And then when we shift and go back into our body and go back into our heart space, maybe we can forgive. I just see that as I've lost interest in what my mother has done to me. I don't, like that's maybe that's forgiveness or moving on. But when it's this codependent, like, oh, you turn the other cheek, oh my God, total BS. Doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's almost like a pick yourself up by the bootstraps kind of a thing. Or some God worse, or some religious kind of like dogma. So hopefully I've answered the question enough there. You got me all fired up with that one. Okay. Hi, Patrick, DMing from my question from the live stream. Short version, can you talk about definitions of disrespect in toxic families? The definitions of disrespect and rules that parents define for us, and how we carry that into our self-policing in adulthood. You guys get the question so far? I'm so into the question. It's a great question. I'm into all these questions. Like overly not wanting to be disrespectful. This is similar to how you said not being allowed to have another favorite band if someone's, yes. So that a beautiful question. And I think it's coming from two places. My biggest theory is what I'm realizing in this life. We spend so much of our psychic energy trying to not be like our parents. So if you go to lunch with somebody and they like, how about pizza? And you're like, I don't want to disrespect them or take anything away from them. So I'm just going to default to their needs. That is trying to not be like our moms or our dads. It's like, damn, no, I'm lactose intolerant. We're going to get Thai food. Fuck that pizza. You know what I mean? Like, or something like that, or something passive aggressive. So that's where that other part of the question, I think, comes from. Definitions of disrespect and toxic families, absolutely. My son, he is now going to this homeschooling program. That's like de-schooling program that is super progressive, and they are all about shared power. And we can disrespect children by just, if you moved in the 4th grade and your parents like, well, we're moving 2 towns over. That's disrespectful because we're not being inclusive. Like, where would you prefer? We have to move, even if it's to say, to give them space and feelings. That's a different angle of being disrespectful, because you're not seeing the child, you're not giving them say in anything. You just treating childs as pets is a form of disrespect. So disrespect, we can have core beliefs really wrapped up in entitlement and disrespect. Some more definitions is who grew up with a parent who had contempt for you? even if it's little quips, little like minor, little microaggressions. Oh, like, yeah, like you thought you'd catch that, meh, you know, very disrespectful. Can be disrespectful around gender. Oh, you're just like your father. Oh, don't be like your mother and do all that stuff, you know? So there's so many levels to it. And I think that in our recovery, doing work around it, around is really going towards the parents, how they parented you in those years, and letting them have it either in an empty chair or letter. And there's a charge to that stuff that needs to go to them. And I think I even asked the last question in the video, who was raised by a miserable parent? That's a form of disrespect, because it's like demanding that everyone else, like they're on stage and everyone needs to like, the miserable parent loves the attention of the misery, which is disrespecting everybody else around them. Great question. Also, any childhood trauma resources and recommendations for people in Massachusetts? Um, you're okay. Yes, there is that group that I'm forming in Massachusetts. If that's what, if I have the question right, that groups are forming in Massachusetts with one of my trainees. You just go to my website and you fill out the long form under I'm interested in working with Christopher Frechette. So there's that. All right. Let me refresh the messages. Wow, I've lost track of time. I'm having fun. Who's having fun? Okay. Another one. Do you need to ever care for aging parents? Curious if you have any thoughts about aging, narcissistic or codependent parents, late 80s. I'm an only child and no other family. They don't need me now, but their old age causes me to remain empathic yet still hold my boundaries. It gets confusing, but I do my best. Mom says she doesn't have some memories anymore. Love what you just said about losing interest. This could be a whole video in and of itself, is what do we do ethically? I think it's like more of a question wrapped up in ethics. What do we do ethically when we have parents who are aging, but they were the abusive parents who did all the damage? For some people, I might recommend to just let it go, because you're not a bad person and you're not being vindictive if taking care of them is going to make you regress or take you back to a place, or simply you don't owe them anything. And I know that that sounds pretty hardcore, but I have said that to clients in that way. And again, I don't fault them for not, don't fault them at all for not being able to kind of do that. They might be getting closure by taking care of them or being a resource for them in some way. So it is a complicated issue. But let me just read it again. Do you need to ever take care for your aging parents? I would say that don't let shame make you feel like you owe them something because they're family. It really depends. I think it really depends. If it's more of a tricky family and it's not like violently abusive and really, you know what I mean? Like there are just some parents out there that had CPTSD themselves and they were a disaster and a disaster parent, versus other parents who have like a sadistic kind of element to them. So it is a hard call, but I would just sort of say, don't do it from a place of shame where it's like, I'm a bad person if I don't. And sometimes our inner child just needs a green light to say, you know what, we don't owe them anything, or practice something good enough that you offer resources from afar. You set up the Meals on Wheels. Maybe you contribute to something financially if you, or whatever, but that like on the ground kind of a thing, super tough. So there's that. Let's see. Great question. Thank you very much for that. All right. Am I out of questions or do I need to refresh here? Okay. Oh, I got a bunch more, I think. For the live Q&A, what books would you recommend that would assist in healing journey from childhood trauma? You touch upon all these terms like trauma noise, and I hear them for the first time in your videos. Well, thank you. Just the general books that I always recommend, start with Bradshaw's Homecoming. For inner child work, there is Inner Bonding by Margaret Paul, the Janet Wojcic's book. Homecoming. And I'm sure you guys have read The Body Keeps the Score. It's a great educational book, but I don't think it kind of touches on the inner child stuff. So does this come up the right mirrored way for you guys, or is this backwards? Janet Voitit's Healthy Parenting, if you're stuck knowing how bad it was. If you struggle with your own parenting, an excellent resource. Inner Bonding by Margaret Paul, the greatest resource that we have so far on inner child work. If you like flow charts and really nailing when you're in your adult and when you're in your child, amazing book. And then Bradshaw, this is what sort of started it all for me. You can get it on Amazon. I got mine signed. I needed another copy. It was like 4 cents on Amazon, used. This really walks through a really great start about shame and the toxic family system. And then what he does is he does some inner child work through the cycles of development, which is interesting. I don't really do it that way, but there's that. Okay, great question there. My question is, do you have any tips for a couple where each person is working through their childhood trauma, but they're in different places in terms of setting boundaries with toxic people, which leads to social awkwardness and safety? I can see where this one's going. Safety concerns for one of the partners. Each of us has ADHD, with adds to delaying action and avoidance and goal setting. We're also in couples therapy and reaching a bit of plateau. I would recommend, there's a handout on my website called the 1-2-3 process, which helps clients really figure out their triggers with each other related to childhood. It's an excellent resource, but I get this question a lot. I'm wondering if the question is something like, my partner is just starting, but my mother-in-law is like all over us about these things, and he shuts down or she shuts down, and it's just like, which is triggering for the other person. That's kind of how I read the question, or how I would assume is a dynamic or a situation. I'm not saying that's your situation, but I get questions like that a lot. And the plus side is 2 people are doing some work, and it just kind of takes a really, really long time. And I find that what's hard about this stuff is, in couples work, sometimes I have problems with couples therapy in the way that sometimes therapists can be too neutral, in a way, like where what I learned is like, we're not exactly kind of neutral. Just to say, like in that example that I just gave, something like, well, how does it feel when your mother imposes herself, and then it dysregulates the 2 of you to have some ownership on the other person? And I might be taking the question in a different way, but do you have any tips for couples working through childhood trauma when they're in different places with setting boundaries with toxic people? The other thing I would add to it is the person writing the question, are you too aggressive about the person who is toxic, in a way that your inner child is really pissed off at your partner for not being more protective? And if that's so, can you allow them to have more of a process? And I'm not trying to dismiss your experience or minimize your experience, but that also makes me kind of think in that way. So there's that. So hopefully I answered that. Question for the live stream. If my parents were abusive and have also been diagnosed with ADHD and definitely have childhood trauma, they refuse to admit, how do I handle identifying with them and wanting to have compassion versus being angry about the abuse and lack of respect or boundaries, especially when they refuse to go to therapy? A little bit of that is great question. Do you guys get the question? It's a question rooted in, like, how do I make this work with people who aren't going to therapy, who they're not admitting what they did growing up, and it's a really, really great question that I don't have a really great answer for. Is what I hear in the question is, our inner child has magical thinking about how to manage something, or has magical thinking about our parents get it. Like my mentor says, we're caught with nothing to work with, but we still assume we have something to work with. So I would say, if you're doing your trauma work, I would go with being pissed off. I would go and really sitting for a while of spending time with, like, what happened to you. I was doing that for 3 or 4 years in a group work with other people doing similar work. I'm not just talking about go be pissed off for a weekend, a long time. But it's such a beautiful question too, is that raise your hand out there If as a child you knew too much about your parents in the way that you saw how limited they were and you were doing the work for them. And that's something our inner child still will do, because it's sort of like you see that they have undiagnosed ADHD, you see they have childhood trauma, but your inner child is like, but wait a minute, I'm the only one that gets it, so therefore it's on me to make something happen. That's not good for you, and you don't have to. A lot of this stuff is letting go of, it's a lot of grief work, actually, letting go of what we actually wanted from our family. So beautiful, beautiful questions. I'm going to answer one more, and then I think I'm going to sign off. And again, if you was this helpful to you, I would love to. I would love to hear that. I would love to do this more. I might do this with every video that kind of comes out to kind of debrief about the video. And if you want to contribute to the channel, the little button down there for the super thanks is right there. And I really appreciate you guys coming to this. I really appreciate the support. Hi, Patrick. Thanks for the work that I'm doing. Makes such a big difference to me. Thank you. And I have this question. As a single mother daughter, I did suffer from her narcissistic abuse. And the morals of her being all that I have kept me attached to her. Okay, I think I get it. Now I'm 25 and I want to fix the program of her being my closest being for her. Now, my question is this: how do I separate the dissociation I have with motherhood, from the role model that it meant being her my only human and relating to that family? I think I get the question. How do I separate? My mentor uses this word reclaim quite a bit. It's a twofold question. Many times is like in the beginning of our work, or when I was incredibly enmeshed with my mother was my best friend, up until things got really, really bad and I left home, and we were pretty enmeshed. And getting unenmeshed and separating myself from her, I needed a lot of support and therapy to do that, and with a therapist who got it. And because my enmeshment was from a little boy, I was programmed to take care of my mother's emotions to the point that I had no emotions of my own. So there's that. That's the first part of the question, is continually, and that is a process. If you talk to your mother every day on the phone, cut that down to once a week as an amazing goal. Cut that down to once a month, because if you're working on yourself every time you go into the fold with an abusive sort of parent in that way, or something that is so familiar, we go backwards and it's more detrimental, I think. And I'm not saying cutoffs have to be forever. Cutoffs are just for the time period that they can be forever, but a cutoff around, or separating, or boundaries around while you're trying to do therapy work and heal. The other piece, while you're doing that, you're going to need to be able to do that to get the second piece done. And that is reclaiming your concept of motherhood with your own daughter. Because again, most of our psychic energy goes into, are we like our parents? Are we making the same mistakes? And it's a mess. And we need a lot of help about being right-sized and becoming the healthy parent that we want to be, and feeling good about that. But the inner child really doesn't see much difference. Like, here, common triggers when we get frustrated or we're mad at our own kids. And a lot of trauma noise will come up around that, and we'll lose our ground because we don't want to be like our parents around them. But yet we're still pissed off at them that they didn't flush the toilet or did the thing or what, like, it's just like, or they were being normal, healthy kids. That's kind of messy. And what's going to be helpful is to reclaim the idea that you're not your mother. You're working on yourself when she never did. And that's kind of my question there. So thank you so much for attending this. I had a blast. I'm a little bit winded. I talk a lot. I loved seeing you all, and I wish I had the time. I wish I wasn't talking so I could have read the chat. And you're welcome to also, if I didn't answer a question, if there's a topic of a video that you really want to see, hold on to my Instagram and put it in there, because I get a lot of ideas from that. Unfortunately, I can't respond to all the ideas or the emails. And thanks for hanging in with me. Thanks for watching the video. Thanks for being part of. Questions were amazing, and I love this community. So I'm going to sign off and have a good night. Next video is probably going to come out in about a week, and I don't know what it is on yet. So bye, you guys. Thank you.